So I'm going to speak about these titanium dioxide nanotubes. You see an example up here, right? Like this is going to be the topic of my talk. And with these tubes, these self-organized tubes on metal surfaces, we've dealt with now more than about 10 years. And you see like a lot of the excitement that I think came along with like year after year doing the research here. So these nanotubes, when we grow them, essentially based on anodization. It's like a very old technique that you can see here. Something like you take a metal and you put it the anode in an electrochemical cell. You take a beaker, immerse two electrodes. One is going to be the anode, the other one the cathode here, and you put the voltage between them. There's various reactions that can take place if you do that. One of the reactions that we're going to use is like that if you have the anode, if your metal of interest is something like titanium, aluminum, niobium, something like of these metals here that are called Wolf metals. If you put them as the anode, that you have the ability to form an oxide layer on the surface. So there's like usually your anode, your metal gets oxidized to something like a corresponding metal ion, and then if the environment is suitable, you get the reaction of the oxidized metal with the environment to form if this water containing an oxide layer on the surface. If this metal here is one of these Wolf metals, then you can form the oxide that grows, the oxide thickness, you can adjust by the voltage that you use. The higher the voltage, the thicker the oxide layer, and you can, for example, produce these beautiful interference patterns on surfaces. So just you make thicker oxide, and because of interference of light, it looks very different colors. Now, this is known already for 100 years or something and not really new. It's used, for example, to make biomedical implants more biocompatible and things like that. Usually this anodization has been carried out in sulfuric acid or phosphoric acid electrolytes, neutral electrolytes or something like that. And in every case, the formation is something like a compact oxide layer. Now, the new thing or the breakthrough thing or the really astonishing thing is like if you put some fluoride ions into this electrolyte. So only adding fluorides to this electrolyte, you can grow now some sort of nanotubular array layers that form entirely self-organized on the entire anodized surface. So whatever shape of metal you put in and you anodize it in this fluoride electrolyte will be coated with this sort of nanotube layer here. Of course, it's not that easy. It's not only fluorides, but you need to optimize quite a number of factors to get as nice tubes as you can see here. So this is a top view of such a nanotube layer. This is a cross-section of such a nanotube layer that has been formed something like under more or less ideal conditions. And we're going to talk about these ideal conditions just in a second a little bit more. So in general, if you do anodization, if you anodize a piece of metal, you make it the anode in such an electrochemical cell, you have different possibilities what can happen. So if the environment is dissolving permanently any oxidized species, you cannot form an oxide layer, and usually the metal is electropolished. It's also used in industrial applications to make really shiny, smooth surfaces. The opposite is if nothing of the oxide that is formed is dissolved. Then you get the compact oxide layers that I've shown you before with these different colors. There's like growing to different thicknesses or something like this. But in this case, it's essentially no dissolution in the electrolyte. And now the key to form something like nanotubes or nanopores is that you have some dissolution in the electrolyte. And I will just talk a little bit later why this is important. So in the intermediate case between total solubility and total insolubility, you can form self-organized structures. They may look like this, then they're nanopores, it's like in porous alumina, for example, or they may look like this here, tubes, as in titanium dioxide nanotubes. Here we have another picture of titanium dioxide nanotubes. Again, the top view. This here is a bottom view of this of such a nanotube layer. And you can see here on the top they're really separated tubes. At the bottom they're like hexagonally arranged. If you do this really under optimized conditions, they're nicely hexagonally arranged. And this here is the metal surface if you lift off the tube layer from the metal. So on the metal you get this dimpled structure left behind too. At the moment there's also many people exploiting the self-organized dimples here as something like templates for secondary reactions or something like that. Now I would like to mention here too, this is not the only form of electrochemical nanotubes that you can form. There's also Masuda that published this type of nanotubes that we call RBA nanotubes. So take a piece of titanium and you don't anodize it in a fluoride electrolyte, but in a perchloric acid electrolyte or something like this under the right conditions, you may get bundles of tubes forming on the surface. The advantage is that these tubes grow extremely fast, but they grow only on certain locations on the surface and just grow these bundles, so this organizational part is lost and they do not really adhere well to the surface. So we're not really focusing on these type of tubes here. Also, I would like to mention another possibility to form self-organized structures on metals is in hot glycerol electrolytes, which I'm not going to talk about in this talk anymore either, but you can also in hot glycerol electrolyte containing phosphates, you can grow structures that thick oxide structures that may be like mesoporous material or this nanochannel material. So there's also channels with about 100 nanometer diameter, just perpendicular to the metal surface, or something like this dendrite tree structure is also possible. So if you're interested in this, then please look up one of the reviews here. Now, a little bit to the formation itself. The oxide usually grows under what we call, or what the electrochemists call, a high field oxidation mechanism. So the anodization takes place by the titanium being oxidized to titanium 4+ species. Then these ions migrate under the applied field. So you have the applied voltage here, say, let's say 20 volts or something like this. You have applied, these ions migrate outward through this oxide layer. At the same time, for charge neutrality, you have something like oxygen anions from the electrolyte entering the titanium dioxide lattice and migrating to the inner interface. So in principle, the oxide can grow at both interfaces, either at the inner or the outer interface. Now, the driving force, as said, is something like the field across the oxide, because the migration is determining the speed of oxide growth. So this is a self-stopping process or self-limiting process if you have a constant voltage here and the thickness is getting thicker and thicker and thicker. So in this case, you get something like with an applied voltage thickness growing fast and then like leveling off at the final value when the field is not strong enough to aid the migration of ions across the oxide layer here. At the same time, of course, the current flowing through the oxide is more or less exponentially dropping here as the field is lowered. So now, what's the difference between this here is just growing a compact oxide layer. This is the normal anodization process when you grow an anodic oxide under high field conditions. If you do now the comparison of this current versus time curve for the fluoride-free case that we just looked at under this high field condition, you have this exponential drop and the compact oxide layer. If you record the current density in a fluoride-containing electrolyte, so again we put a piece of titanium into the electrolyte, counter electrode, apply 20 volts, and just monitor the current over time. Then in the first phase, this current drops also exponentially. And then, if you take the sample out at this moment from the electrolyte and look at the sample, you see that also in this case, in the early stage, a compact oxide layer has formed. And this compact oxide layer is about as thick as the compact oxide layer that you have formed at this moment in a fluoride-free electrolyte. In the fluoride-containing electrolyte, you get then a current increase, and at that moment you see that this top layer, this is this layer here, is getting permeated with little channels here, and underneath you get the formation, the self-organized formation of these nanotube structures. Now, and then with time over here. These tubes grow longer and longer and longer into the substrate. Now, you can see already one effect of the fluorides is that you have much higher current density here. So there's a steady state value where permanently current is flowing and oxide is produced. So the main effect of fluorides to the electrolyte is that they maintain a steady state thickness of the oxide layer at the level that is lower than the finite value that would correspond to the compact oxide layer. Chemically, this is just done by two factors. One is just the chemical dissolution, permanent chemical dissolution of the oxide layer at the outer interface. And secondly, the direct capturing of titanium 4+ species arriving at the oxide electrolyte interface and solvatizing this as titanium hexafluoride. So by this, these fluoride ions are able, by just permanently dissolving the titanium dioxide, to establish something like formation-dissolution equilibrium. Now, a key to form not only a flat oxide, but to form something like the tubular layers is that, of course, at such an interface of the metal oxide, you have compressive stress due to the volume expansion of the oxide. And now, if you imagine, in this case, you have, of course, compressive stress too, but it is frozen because the layer cannot grow anymore. In this case, it's permanently oxide is produced, and therefore, this compressive stress may aid now the shaping of the tubes upwards and forming these tubular structures. Now, a little bit more quantitative, one can model this. This we did in this work here together with Kurt Hebert. If you have this, if you have this formation dissolution equilibrium, then originally the question was, how can such a perturbated interface be stable? Why is it possible to have this corrugated interface here? And the answer is because of the stress at this interface combined with the permanent flux of oxide. If you use here perturbation analysis, you can predict under which conditions such perturbation is really stable, under which dissolution conditions is such a perturbation, such a situation possible. And if you do this, then you come up with this figure here. This figure shows the efficiency of oxide formation. That means how much oxide is formed by the current. Something like 70% oxide, 70% of the current is going into oxide formation. And for example, and 30% is going into dissolution. And so you can see here the model predicts stability of such a corrugated interface for a certain range of dissolution. So if you do this, if you use this model for aluminum oxide, you get something like these points over here, the triangle, so between about 65% oxygen growth efficiency and 70%, this situation is stable. Too much oxide, too much dissolution leads to a flat oxide, and too little dissolution leads to a compact oxide layer formation. And so you can use this for aluminum oxide, and you can use this for titanium dioxide, and you see here the lines are something like the theoretical predictions, and all these triangles here are something like the experimental values. And of course, this depends on the Pilling-Bedworth ratio. This Pilling-Bedworth ratio is the oxide expansion. So how much metal is converted into oxide. The higher this Pilling-Bedworth ratio, the more stress is generated at the interface. So it's logical that this here, like that these boundaries here depend on the stress at the interface. So at the moment, this model is not bad. It predicts the behavior of the the formation of the self-organized structures quite well. But there's other factors that are still not in the model, something like which strongly affect the growth too. There's like field distribution effects. You can imagine, like, if the field distribution is not even, if you have inhomogeneities, you have local field flow or local field enhancement at the points where the oxide is thinner. Then changes in local chemistry, because during your reaction you may acidify the tubes or the tube bottoms, and this may change also the behavior, the solubility of the oxide. In the end, experimentally, it's going back to this dissolution idea is corresponding very well with something like an empirical finding by Ms. Ono et al., like that a critical ion flux is needed across an oxide layer in order to establish self-organization. And if you look at it experimentally, it's exactly like this. Here you see a plot of tube lengths, tubes formed as a function of something like applied voltage and applied concentration, fluoride concentration in the electrolyte. And you see here that these tubes grow under certain conditions the fastest. There's almost like a singularity. If you go here faster, if you want to grow them faster by increasing the voltage or by increasing the increasing concentration of fluorides, you cannot do it anymore. You just cannot grow tubes anymore. So there is something like one point in this diagram where you get the highest degree of self-organization. And this is something like the point where you have optimized dissolution, something like the optimized formation-dissolution equilibrium. Okay, now this is not only true for titanium, it's also possible, this fluoride approach is expandable to a lot of elements, something like zirconium, hafnium, tantalum, niobium, tungsten, iron. And of course, we work not only on this titanium, but also on a lot of other oxides like these. Here, more recent work on iron oxides, hematite nanotubes formed by self-organization, which are very interesting. We work here with Stefan Kment together and trying to use these tubes in water splitting applications, for example. This is another example, grown tubes on vanadium surfaces, vanadium pentoxide, self-organized porous layers, tubular layers. Such tubes may be very interesting in terms of catalysis. Vanadium oxide is a good catalyst for various organic reactions, but also as insertion devices such as batteries or electrochromic devices. Most recently, we managed a very challenging topic that was cobalt oxide, because cobalt oxide is a very good oxygen evolution catalyst. It was very difficult to form anodic layers on this layer, on cobalt, so we managed. And of course, these layers here, now we explore in terms of something like oxygen evolution catalysis, and again, in terms of something like batteries or electrochromic devices. Now, one point is like, if you look at literature, you would think that all these different elements like niobium, tantalum, iron and so on would find a huge amount of interest. But if you look at the publications that are published per year over the years, then you see here that this is separated or distinguished according to different elements. Then you see here that still by far the largest number of publication is going into titanium dioxide nanotubes and not something like tungsten trioxide, although very functional too, or zirconium oxide or something like this. And the reason for this is, of course, the high number of application or high functionality of TiO2, as it has various properties that can be exploited, something like photocatalytic properties, solar energy conversion, and so on. I'll speak a little bit more about the different properties of titanium dioxide in just a moment. So let me just give you, again, very quick background to the nanotube history so far. So we usually say that these self-organized nanotube layers or something like this history can be divided into something like about 3 phases. Like the first generation nanotubes, where nanotubes looked approximately as they are shown here. So you can see here the titanium metal and perpendicular to it, the tube layers being formed. And in this case, these first generation nanotubes, you could grow tube layers to about 500 nanometers thickness and very badly organized. And the oldest work to this is this Asfour-Desfouli work, already published in 1984, but nobody really paid attention to this. It took years until this idea picked up, and one even found this paper only very recently. And I think that this big step from these badly organized nanotubes to to nicely self-organized nanotubes, as you can see them down here, was really done in our lab, and one of the pioneers, Jan Matzak over there, you see like, this was something like the introduction, what we would call the second generation of nanotubes, really start tailoring the electrolyte towards optimized formation, dissolution, equilibrium. So nowadays, one can grow self-organized nanotube layers in fluoride electrolytes in a certain concentration range, typically between about 0.05 and 0.5 weight% of fluorides. On the ionization voltage between about 2 and 20 volts. And this is the effective voltage that you use for ionization. So if you do the ionization in non-aqueous electrolytes, like now mostly done, say, in ethylene glycol-based electrolytes, you need to consider the IR drop. So you may apply 100 volts, but the effective voltage still remains something like 20 volts or something like this. When the tubes are formed, like these structures here, they contain titanium dioxide, but quite a high amount of fluoride too. It's like decorating the tubes, and the material is amorphous, but can be annealed to anatase. Tube diameter can be adjusted by the ionization voltage, so the voltage directly influences the diameter of the tubes between about 10 and 800 nanometers. The tube wall layer thickness between about 10 and 30 nanometers, and the entire layer thickness can be adjusted between about 100 nanometers, so very thin tubes, to about 300 micrometer, very high aspect ratio tubes. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a tube shape that you produce. Like, as I said before, you can influence the diameter of these nanotubes by the applied voltage. So if you start changing the voltage during the ionization process, you can form something like bamboo type nanotubes. So it's like just periodically changing the voltage during ionization. You have smaller and bigger diameter of the tubes here. The same principle is used here for tube branching. So you grow the tubes at a certain voltage and then lower the voltage to a specific value, and you can create branching of these big nanotubes into smaller nanotubes. Quite useful for some applications. You can create such nanotube laces, because you can etch out here selectively the inner part of this bamboo structure, and then you're left with this connecting part here. Then the material that you obtain is this nanotube lace. Or here we just produced a tube stack where we made first anodic layer, made it super hydrophobic, and then through this super hydrophobic layer we etched a second layer underneath. So this tube stack here is then shown to be amphiphilic. This we were doing in view of something like drug delivery applications. Now, you can further improve the functionality of the tubes by suitable junction formation, so by just electrodepositing material into the tubes, by decorating the tube walls, in this case nickel oxide, so this was aiming at forming PN junctions at the titanium dioxide nickel oxide interface. So nickel oxide is a P-type semiconductor, and this was towards solar cell applications. Here decorating the tube walls with titanium dioxide nanoparticles is very important when you need a high surface area, so making hierarchical structure where you want to have fast electron transport, but at the same time need a high surface area. In this case here, we filled the nanotubes with magnetic particles. This is more or less just putting a nanotube layer, take the nanotube layer, putting a ferrofluid on it and a magnet underneath, and it sucks the magnetic nanoparticles directly into these tubes and leads to really nice complete filling of the nanotubes and to magnetically guidable structures. Now, very interesting, and for many applications very interesting, is that you can form not only these self-organized tubes on pure titanium, but also titanium alloys. And this is a way of doping the tubes. So if you want to grow something like niobium-doped tubes or tantalum-doped tubes, you can form an alloy, and in the structure that is formed, this oxide is going to be incorporated. This is an example here where we had the titanium niobium alloys and grew something like titanium niobium mixed oxide structures. And you can see here the result is that the conductivity in the niobium doped material is about 10 times higher than the conductivity in pure titanium dioxide tubes. And this, of course, important for almost any photoelectrochemical applications. If you have 10 times higher conductivity, in many cases you can increase efficiency quite considerable. Another possibility of mixing things or getting elements together is growing tubes from metal stacks. So this here is a tube layer grown on a titanium tantalum multi-metal layer stack. So this metal here this is a spotted layer of titanium and tantalum, and these original layers consist of 2 nanometers tantalum and 8 nanometers titanium, was anodized, and you can see here in the tubes that grow, then you can have something like really like almost like a superlattice stack here of tantalum oxide and titanium dioxide. So this is a possibility to laterally or like horizontally incorporate junctions that may be helpful for charge carrier separation. Now, before I said like we can make alloys and we can anodize them, and this is of course true for all the elements that are more or less non-noble. So when you anodize them, they form oxides. If you put metals inside that are in a way not so easily oxidizable, noble metals, like gold for example, then the anodization leads not to incorporation of gold oxide or something, but it leads to self-decoration of the nanotubes, as you can see here. So in this case, we used titanium gold alloy with only about 0.02% gold. And if after anodization, the tube layers are completely decorated with nanoparticles, it's about 4 nanometers in diameter. They showed very high catalytic activity, and I'll show you later an example of how to use such titanium dioxide gold composites, if you want to say like this. Now, just give you a very quick overview of some uses of the nanotube. So these nanotubes, meanwhile, over the last 10 years have been explored in almost any direction that titanium dioxide in the world has been explored. So mostly it's been exploited as nanoparticles, pigments, or something like this. And in applications like photocatalysis, where more or less you take the titanium dioxide as a semiconductor, you generate electron hole pairs, and you react the electron and holes with the environment. And the most typical applications for photocatalysis are something like, at the moment, this water splitting application. So essentially creating electron hole pairs, and you have the electron here reacting with water to produce hydrogen, or and at the same time have the hole reacting with water producing oxygen. So this is of course heavily investigated right now, and here the tubes are also heavily investigated. Another one is pollution degradation. I will show you an example in just a second. And the third one is of using this, almost not explored up to now, is something like really using it for organic catalytic reactions. Now, very much investigated are the tubes in Grätzl-type solar cells. So the idea being very simple. So if maybe most of you have a rough idea how Grätzl-type solar cells work. Up to now, or the classic Grätzl-type solar cells are formed of titanium dioxide nanoparticles. They are compacted to a layer or something and coated with a dye, with a suitable dye. And the dye is essentially the light absorber. The dye is excited and injects an electron into the conduction band of the TiO2, and the TiO2 is more or less just an electronic conductor scaffold here, transporting the electron to the backside of the solar cell. If you look at this structure, then it has several loss mechanisms of efficiency, something like these particles, for example, are something like forming a random network. So particles, like electrons generated in the titanium dioxide network may diffuse very far distances before reaching here the back contact. And this, of course, you can maybe overcome if you have directional electron transfer. So if the diffusion part is just limited, or diffusion direction is just limited by the vertical alignment of the nanotubes, you force shorter diffusion passes on the system. The second thing is that these particles here may have junctions, and at these junctions often recombination may be dominant. So if you replace these junctions by a nanotube, you may have second advantage of using these nanotubes. So far, the record of nanotube-based solar cells is still lower than the nanoparticle part here. But this is mainly due to the high surface area of these nanoparticles used in Grätzl solar cell. Nevertheless, now recently hierarchical structures are coming up that look very promising and maybe even beating original Grätzl cell particle-based solar cells. Another use of these titanium dioxide nanotubes is say as membranes. So you can lift off the titanium dioxide nanotube layer from the surface and open the backside. Then you have like flow-through membranes that you can even handle relatively easily. And these flow-through membranes have, of course, the advantage that they combine two effects. They act as a filter, and at the same time they have all the titanium dioxide properties that I showed before. I'll give you an example of this, how to use this. This is a membrane that we made now, not by self-organized nanotube formation, but that we formed by this hot glycerol process by anodizing this titanium foil just completely. So this is 10 micron thick titanium foil anodized completely. It looks just from the side like this, very compact, but if you put a droplet of something like dyed water on it, you can see that it's permeable to liquids. If you look at it in the SEM and TEM, you can see that the whole layer now consists of channels that are about 8 to 10 nanometers wide, and TEM just confirmation of this. And in this case, it's interesting that you can have the anodization. So in this case, the anodization takes place from the front and back side at the same time. And where the two layers meet, you still have openings being present. And so the whole structure here works as a membrane with openings of about 10 nanometers or something like this. And of course, now you can use them as a filter. In this case, we use them for separating some proteins. In this case, we use proteins with different diameters. So in this case, this cytochrome C, 1.6 nanometer diameter, up to this galaxy days here with about 6.8 nanometer diameter. And if you measure in such a permeation cell here, the permeation of the proteins from one side to the other side through this membrane here, then you can see that, of course, according to the diameter, they're separated. So the smallest one goes through and the biggest one doesn't go through anymore. But this you could do also with an aluminum oxide membrane if you can fabricate these 10 nanometer channels. The huge advantage of this titanium dioxide is that at the same time it carries photocatalytic properties. And one of the photocatalytic features of titanium dioxide is that the holes generated when you shine light on it, the holes are have a very high oxidative power, so very high electrochemical potential, so high that they can form OH radicals from H2O in the environment. And this is used you can use to decompose virtually any organic compound to CO2 and H2O. And now, in this case, you may have noticed before, like if you do this permeation experiment, like the curves here, the permeation curves all like taper off at a certain level. And this is due to slow clogging of the membrane when you put the proteins through. So if you make the experiment even longer, in this case even longer, you may get complete clogging of the membrane, so it's completely blocked, doesn't let any fluid through anymore. Now, using the photocatalytic properties of TiO2, you may now shine light onto this membrane and therefore decompose the proteins that are stuck in the membrane, and therefore reopen the membrane again and declog it. So the membranes become reusable, and this, I think, is a very nice feature of such membrane properties combined with photocatalytic properties. So I would very quickly tell you a little bit more like another application of these titanium dioxide nanotubes, and where we have been really exploring a lot in the last 5 years together with our biomedical department and our medical department in the university, is like using it as a biocompatible coating on body replacement parts, something like hip implants or dental implant material. So this is like typical hip implant, and this is a dental screw, both of them containing to a large extent of titanium. Now, to modify the surface, for example, on dental implants has been done for many, many years, and people investigated something like a lot of modification properties, like putting lithographically indents into the surfaces here. And mostly they did it with a size that is about the size of a cell, something like 10 to 50 micrometers or something like this. And they find usually that the material becomes more biocompatible due to this geometric arrangement of tubes or pores here. When we started, was the question like, can the cells also, or can cells also interact on the nanoscale? So can cells really see something like nanoscale features on surfaces? And the biochemists more or less came up with it may be possible if it's like they think that integrins are more or less responsible for recognizing topography on surfaces in general. And these integrins that are present here in the cell wall, they more or less have a diameter or a spacing, or this protein here has a size of about 10 to 15 nanometers. And so may be possible in the beginning of our work that the cells may recognize nanoscale features. And in our case, we just tried out different diameter nanotube surfaces. So we grew nanotube surfaces from 15 nanometer to 100 nanometer diameter onto titanium surfaces, and then did cell tests. This here is work that's been done together with Klaus von der Mark's group at the Department of Experimental Medicine. They did all the cell tests and so on. And here you can see results of cell tests where we put mesenchymal stem cells. These green dots here are the green labeled mesenchymal stem cells, were originally with the same density put onto 15 nanometer nanotube surfaces and 100 nanometer nanotube surfaces. As said, originally same density, and then we looked at them, how do they behave with time. So after 10 hours you can see already that on the 15 nanometer nanotube surface there's many more cells present than on the 100 nanometer nanotubes, and this is even more significant if you look at the cells at the surface after 3 days. And if you look at the individual behavior of cells, then you see also very significant difference. So this here is more or less a movie of the cell behavior. It's time accelerated, but you see this cell here on the 15 nanometer nanotube surface. So you have 15 nanometer nanotube surface like this, and the cell is on it, and you look onto this cell. And in this case, this cell here spreads very widely, it's very flat, and our biochemists say that this cell is really happy. This here is the cell. Let's see whether I can make it run again. This cell here is on the 100 nanometer nanotube surface. This is a cell that our biochemists say is unhappy. So the cell puts these philopodia out and forward and retracts, and is trying to find better location on the surface, but cannot. And the result, if you do statistical evaluation, then you find beneficial effect and less beneficial effects. So This here, cell adhesion, cell proliferation, or cell migration, are all good effects. The higher cell adhesion, the higher cell proliferation, and the higher cell migration, the happier is the cell. And you see here this activity of the cell as a function of the diameter of the nanotube surface. And you see that in all these cases, the 15 nanometer nanotube surface promotes cell activity. So cells feel happy and much better. And down here you can see the negative effect of the 100 nanometer nanotube surface. This is the apoptosis rate. So this is like the suicide rate of cells. If they're not happy, they kill themselves. And you see here that is unbelievable how strong this effect is on a 100 nanometer case, that the cells just die. And so our biochemists came up with a model like this. And the idea is very, very rough idea and very straightforward. It's more or less if the integrin cluster fits onto the surface, onto the 15 nanometer nanotube surface, it does not send. It sends virtually no apoptosis signals to the nucleus of the cell, and if they don't fit, you have a lot of attempts of the cells docking to the surface, and that sends apoptosis signal to the nucleus. In any way, whether the model is right or not, it shows the beneficial effect of the nanotube layers on biomedical or potential benefit for biomedical applications. So in the next step were real animal experiments where nanotube surfaces were put onto such dental implants here, or into samples that looked approximately like this, and they put into the skull of domestic pigs, and then animal tests were performed after some time. And the result was indeed that significantly better bone implant contact. This is what the dentists like. Dentists like when they put the screws into the jawbone or something like this. They measure the area that is in contact with the jawbone compared with the area that is not in contact. And for the tube coated surface, one found indeed much higher contact area. But the also very important part was that the tubes were not breaking off, like the tubes were still present. If the tubes are short enough, something like 500 nanometer, they're not breaking off during the screwing of the dental implant into the jawbone. So at the moment, there's still strong ongoing research here into using this maybe really for applications. Now, in principle, one problem was, I would like to mention, one problem in the beginning was that classic biomedical alloys, something like titanium, aluminum, vanadium, or something like this, are two-phase alloys, and they are not so easy to uniformly coat with titanium dioxide nanotubes. So in the beginning, we had this problem here that we could form on one of the phases of an alloy the nanotubes and on the other not. But the problem essentially got solved itself already by new generation of biomedical implant alloys, as they're shown here. In this case, you can grow very uniform titanium dioxide nanotube layers, and sometimes they show even really interesting behavior, like two size scale self-organization on such alloys. There's like on this quite complex alloy here, this Ninomi alloy that we got from Tohoku University, we could see that the nanotubes form here show essentially two distinct size distributions. So they have nanotubes that are something like 105 nanometer in diameter that are surrounded by 55 nanometer nanotube surfaces. So let me quickly just mention something more recent. Yeah, like, you know, you've seen that like the first generation of nanotube looked about like this, and then a lot of the nanotube history went into making these nanotubes longer and smoother. So making smooth nanotubes, make them longer than 7 micrometers, second generation, third generation, making them 260 micrometers and smooth. But it's also worth revisiting this first case again. So usually people moved this way in tailoring the organic electrolyte more and more and more to make highly defined tubes. But you can also, what we tried recently, just revisit this case and change parameters. So you can obtain what we call our, at the moment, one of our favorite nanotubes, really long-range order nanotubes, where these nanotubes look from the top really extremely nicely self-organized, and from the side are only about 200 nanometer long. But these nanotube surfaces provide quite a lot of advantages, and very quickly I'd like to show you before finishing the lecture. So one of the huge advantage is that these tubes can be easily filled by spotter deposition. It's like, so if you take the tube layer and you spot it by almost any system and almost any technique, you can fill these tubes completely conformally with something like any metal you wish. In this case, something like nominally 100 nanometer gold is deposited onto the nanotubes. And one way of using this is, of course, just using them as templating. That is not so spectacular, so you make back contact here and then you just dissolve essentially all this nanotube layer and the metal underneath, and you have something like the metal template forming bumps, like gold, palladium, platinum, palladium bumps on surfaces. In this case, you can use this, for example, as anti-reflection coatings or something like that. Another much more interesting and much more thrilling application is using this structured material as a dewetting template. So dewetting usually works like this, that if you put a compact metal film onto any oxide surface and you heat it up, then you have dewetting of the metal. And the dewetting usually occurs like this, depending on here the gold film that is put on a titanium dioxide substrate. If it's a nominal thickness of the gold film was 1 nanometer, 2 nanometer, or 20 nanometers, you heat it up, the gold film breaks up, and it breaks up usually into random, more or less random patterns or something like this. If you do this with on these highly ordered substrates, in this case using these short nanotubes, these highly ordered nanotubes that I showed you before, you coat it with gold, something like, in this case, like 20 nanometer gold, nominally coated, and then you dewet the surface. You get the breakup of the metal layer into individual structures, where every tube here is filled with exactly 1 nanoparticle. And I think this is quite amazing and quite useful, as I will show an example in a second. So this is just showing it's really long-range order again. And here I would just like to show you like an example of using these tubes in a photocatalytic application in something like the decomposition of water alcohol splitting. So where something like you generate hydrogen essentially from water alcohol mixtures using photocatalysis. And here, more or less, the fact that this gold particle is present has more or less two effects, right? Like if you decorate titanium dioxide with a gold particle, there's 2 effects, or with a platinum particle too. That first of all, you get a local change in the electronic properties of the material, which is going to help the separation of electron-hole pairs. And secondly, in case, for example, if you use a hydrogen recombination catalyst like platinum, something like the hydrogen evolution. And if you look at our geometry here, then it's almost an ideal geometry for UV water splitting, because the tube length is about 200 nanometers. This is about almost absorbing all the UV light that is available under these conditions. So a very short structure is already good enough to really absorb the UV light. Then if you think that here the wall thickness is about 10 to 20 nanometers, and compare this to the whole diffusion length in titanium dioxide nanotube, very advantageous too, something like same range, so we don't lose too many holes by recombination. And the third thing is that the diameter of the tubes, maybe about 100 nanometers, is something like in the range of the diffusion length of hydroxy radicals. So if we produce here hydroxy radicals and they diffuse this, say, 50 nanometers wide, then we have complete flooding of the inside with OH radicals. And that's of a high benefit too. And just as an example, how much better this surface works in something like the decomposition of alcohol water mixtures than just putting titanium dioxide, a flat compact titanium dioxide, and decorating with conventional nanoparticles with about same density, same amount of gold, compared to this geometry you see here about a 10-fold increase. So, and I think there's many more applications for this sort of nanostructures where you have really the ordered placement of a metal particle in one nanotube, such as, like, I didn't show example like memory devices or something like this, like anti-reflection coatings. Well, there's quite a lot more that I could tell, but I think is a little bit, we are up in time here, and so I'd like to just finalize by, I think you have seen that the titanium dioxide nanotubes have quite a lot of applications, and you can expand it to alloys, to different materials. So this approach is quite universal to create self-organized structures. And almost the applications are virtually endless and more or less the same as the oxide material, just in a nanotubular shape. So thank you very much, and thanks all the people for their contribution here. Thank you.